Welcome back to Joe and the Fat Man. Joe Smeltzer, Kyle Fat Man Golik with you. And we just talked about, we put a bow really on Penn State's week 1 46-11 win over Nevada at Beaver Stadium. Penn State was a 42.5 point favorite in that game. Guess what? They're a 42.5 point favorite for their next game against Florida International. And really, this is going to be a bloodbath you would expect, much like Nevada. Florida International not only is a group of 5 program. It's a pretty bad group of 5 program. At least it was last season, going 4-8. It is 1-0 this year. Got a 42-9 win over Bethune-Cookman, but come on now. What does that prove? Penn State, we know they're gonna win this week. The question is by how much. Will they cover? They didn't cover last week. Nevada got a backdoor cover with a touchdown and a 2-point conversion with 25 seconds left. But Kyle, this is really going to be a similar situation to last week. It's, nobody gets hurt. We're hoping. You hope that in any game, but especially in a game like this. B, what young players is Penn State able to use and which ones are able to take advantage of that opportunity. A guy that I'm looking for this week is Quentin Martin. James Franklin said that Martin was out for a few weeks with a tweak in fall camp, and that's why he didn't play against Nevada. It sounds like late in the game, Martin's going to be an option along with Cam Wallace and Corey Smith to get out there against Florida International. And yeah, number 3 is just what does Penn State really need to work on? Because the biggest glaring weakness, I think, in the Nevada game was the red zone offense. Ryan Barker kicked 4 field goals. He made all of them, but Ryan Barker shouldn't be kicking 4 field goals against Nevada. Those should be touchdowns. But we listened to Franklin's press conference. I just got done with it, actually. It's 1:16 right now as it is recording. Franklin's presser got over around 12:40. What are your takeaways, Kyle, from that? And what do you make, if anything, of Florida International?
So Florida International, and this will be in my get to know your opponent this week. They've only had 4 winning seasons in their program history. So again, not a lot of success. This is one of those programs that they I don't even think they should be in a football bowl subdivision. That's just me. I mean, there's not a lot of success. It isn't like they've taken over, made moves like Florida Atlantic, which started around the same time. And programs like Central Florida and South Florida are actually bigger schools if you actually get down there, with Central Florida now being in a Power 4 conference. So, what I'm looking for this week for the most part is I want to see the running game dominate. I think we know what we have in the passing game. I'd like to see if Devontae Ross is healthier and if he can do something. Because I don't want to be going into Oregon without seeing what we got with Devontae Ross. And I think James Franklin would agree with that. Don't you agree, Joe?
On Devontae Ross, absolutely. He's frankly even mentioned that they didn't see too much of Devontae Ross against Nevada, and we expected that, right? Franklin said during his Nevada week press conference that Ross was going to split reps with Liam Clifford, and that's what ended up happening. Clifford ended up getting more reps than Ross per Pro Football Focus, but I'll disagree with you in the sense that I kind of do want to see them work on the passing game a little bit more. Not necessarily with Trevor Pena and Kyron Hudson, who we saw a lot of last week, but there were guys in that passing game that really didn't get involved. Devontae Ross obviously being one, which you mentioned, but I might like to see a little more of Kobe Howard. He's a true freshman who people were expecting might have a big play or two against Florida International, and it just didn't happen. And I want to see a little more of the tight ends. Franklin admitted after the Nevada game that Ethan Grunkemeyer completed a late pass to Khalil Dinkins, and that was done solely so Khalil Dinkins could get a touch and get involved. I would like to see a little more of Khalil Dinkins. If you're going to be called the most complete tight end in the country, which Franklin said in his Florida International presser. He also said that about Tyler Warren last season, for whatever that's worth. But I want to see more of Khalil Dinkins. And, Penn State has been known as a tight end factory. And we didn't really see too much of that in against Nevada. Andrew Rapplier was probably the guy making the most plays. And I think if you're Penn State, you want to see more of Khalil Dinkins and you want to see more of Luke Reynolds.
Well, and here's where I'm going with this here, Joe. You know, if you look at the final game book, it looks like the play calling was 50-50 for the running and the passing. And you can say that, but when a quarterback runs like Drew Allard did, he did 6 times. Ethan Grunkmeyer did a handful of times, and Trevor Pena had a run. There's about 10 or 11 plays there between those 3 that were really not running plays from the get-go. Maybe Pena's, you can call it that. So the Penn State only really ran the ball 20 to 25 times in against Nevada. And to me, running backs are they got to be in rhythm. And I James said post game that there was probably things he saw in film. What I saw in there was, you had 5-man defensive fronts, and James alluded to this as well, and there was really no holes. So it's a question of why I want to see the running game blow up. Is there's, the 135 yards they got against Nevada, I got to think that's the fewest for an out-of-conference game, like, of that ilk, like from a group of 5 out-of-conference competition, at least since 2021, when they were not a really good running team. I want to, I'd like to see it, and I'm going to cite Urban Meyer. I want to see 250 from Penn State. I want to see 250 in the air. I want to see 250 on the ground, and we got a W. And, when you watch Ohio State, that's what ends up happening against these inferior teams. They rack and stack it. I mean, how they get to the 250, that's how they do. But I'd like to see Penn State. This team is way too talented to not be getting 2 bills on the ground against, Florida International. I'd like to see James basically empty the bench and get everyone touches. That's, to me, how bad Florida International is. Let's empty the bench. I don't need Katron or Nick carrying it 30 times against Florida International. That's an alarming. But they should at least have 25 between the 2 of them and going through there. Like Penn State, the defense has to force the 3 and outs. And, really what the defensive job in that game is, Joe, is to get Penn State to have as many plays as possible. And look, if there's a lot of explosive plays, that's even better. That's another thing I want to see them work on is it's hard to work on an explosive play. That just it kind of just happens. We often joke with the Seinfeld, with the Paul O'Neill episode where Kramer comes in and goes, "Hey, do you can you hit 3 home runs today?" Like, hitting a home run is, hard in itself. But I think for Penn State, they, guys like Nick Singleton, who has that ability, should be able to get into the back 7 of the Florida International Panthers and really should have that one big broken play. That's where I'm at with it.
Yeah, and a part of this, too, is how many plays does Penn State's offense get, right? James Franklin mentioned after the Nevada game that Nevada did a pretty good job of, when they were on offense, always running down the play clock to at least 5 seconds. That you keep time of possession that way. That's something that these lower-level teams are going to try to do against Penn State. In fact, Kent State, of all teams, for as bad as it was, in that 56-0 loss, they actually did a fairly decent job of running the play clock down on offense to make the scoreboard a little closer than it actually was in that first half. But yeah, you talked about the running game, Kyle, and also wanting to empty the bench. Do you think we see Tyke Hayes and/or Jabri Coleman on Saturday? Because we did not see them against Nevada. Do you think it's a realistic possibility that those guys could get some touches? With, of course, you're going to want to use Corey Smith and especially Quentin Martin, who didn't play last week as well, and Cam Wallace.
I'm going to say Penn State's at least going to get. So here's my guest hierarchy right now beyond Katron and Nick. I think Cam Wallace is RB3. Agree?
James Franklin won't say it, but it certainly seems that way, yeah.
All right. So now I think you at RB4, I think Corey is at 4 and Quentin's at 5. Again, availability sometimes is the best ability. I think we're going to at least get to RB5 level. Okay. To get to RB7 level, it's going to be like I think when Penn State played Idaho and blew them out like 70 some to nothing a few years ago. I think was it 79?
77, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, but I do think between the Florida International game and the Villanova game, there will be the proverbial emptying of the bench. There should be. And if they don't get to that point, it's not an indictment on them, but it's a missed opportunity for sure, because you should, against teams like this, if you're as good as Penn State is, you should be emptying the bench at least once in these 3 games.
Yeah, you absolutely should be. And Cam Wallace is a guy that, James Franklin talked up over camp based on what we were able to see. Not that it was much during our media practice windows. It was always Cam Wallace working with the Freeze. So he was, seemed like based on that he would be Penn State's number one guy behind, obviously, Nicholas Singleton and Katron Allen. He was a guy that James Franklin talked about along with Andrew Rapplier, and this is getting more into what Franklin said in his press conference, which we'll talk about in the next segment. But he liked what those two guys were able to do, and he said it was magnified because they're coming off of injury. Andrew Rapplier missed almost all of last season due to injury. Cam Wallace got hurt against Kent State in what was a very nasty injury, and the fact that he's able to do what he's doing right now, coming off of that, is really something to speak of.
That hurdle there, was that on a third
Yep.
down? You got that hurdle?
Yeah, that was,
That's huge.
yeah, and especially it made people think about another Penn State running back that wore number 26. But yeah, I think that we talked about the running backs. Talking about Rapplier, Kyle, Franklin said that if Rapplier didn't get hurt last year, Luke Reynolds probably would have redshirted, and that's a pretty heavy compliment. And Rapplier is a guy that's easy to forget about, right? With how much Khalil Dinkins was talked about over the summer as being the elder statesman, with how much Luke Reynolds has been talked about going back to high school when he was a 5-star recruit and what he was able to do in limited action last season, burning his red shirt. It's easy to forget about Rapp, and Rapp made some plays Saturday that I think made Penn State fans think about him a little bit as a guy that might have a bigger role in this offense than it would have been thought of in the offseason.
Well, yeah, and this goes back to the 2024 spring game when Rapp had a monster game, and he, I believe, had a touchdown in that game as well.
He did.
Yeah, and when we had the media availability at practice when we were up there, I hung around the red zone drills, and Rapp was coming down with everything. And he's looking like he's going to play himself into this situation, which is, hey, it's a good problem to have when you're that deep and you have a bunch of hands you're trying to feed if you're James Franklin. Khalil Dinkins, is absolutely fantastic. I mean, he was on Feldman's freak list and whatnot. But again, what's going to happen in the opportunities that you're given? In a lot of ways, Franklin admitted to, we wanted to get Dinkins a touch. Like it just wasn't there for it. I'm wondering, Joe, as I think through this, is someone like Khalil Dinkins, who may be a complete package, as James Franklin alludes to, is he just going to be more of like that victim of circumstance where it's, hey, when Reynolds gets the ball, he makes a splash play, and when Rapp gets it, it's a splash play. But maybe when Dinkins is in, it's just not there for him, and it's there for everyone else, and it's just like at some point, it's like, and I'm trying to break this out, so maybe it's just not there for him. I hate to sound like that, but that happens.
Yeah, it does happen. And part of it, too, is that Penn State doesn't really need won't need the tight ends if the receiving core is much improved, which Saturday, that's a pretty good sign that it is. But if Penn State doesn't need to throw to the tight end as much as it did last year with Tyler Warren, and taking nothing away from Tyler Warren at all, obviously, we all know how good he is. He was a first round pick for a reason, going to have a great, I think we all think he's going to have a great NFL career. But, part of his success was due to necessity. Penn State didn't have good receivers. And, you got to throw the ball, especially with a quarterback like Drew Aller. And Tyler Warren was clearly the best target. In this season, Penn State's best target, I don't think is one of the tight ends. In fact, I don't know if one of the tight ends would be in the top three as far as passing targets go. So, yeah, I think it's a combination of, as you said, that circumstance of it being a talented room. And also, Penn State just doesn't need to rely on the tight ends now as much as it did last year and maybe even in years before that.
Yeah, like I know I've said this to ad nauseum, and our audience probably would agree on this, that why I always felt Warren had the most valuable season of any Penn State offensive player in the 21st century. And you can we could probably argue this all time, but I'll just at least keep the scope to the 21st century, is if Tyler Warren wasn't as good as he was, Penn State's probably in the Citrus Bowl. Let's just put it out there.
I think that's fair.
That's how valuable. Like, I don't know how we could create a football version of War for those who are baseball fanatics, but I think someone trying to replace Tyler Warren a season ago, like, his value was so high, I don't think anyone could. And this year, it's hard to tell. I firmly believe the script in Nevada, Joe, and this is kind of another thing I took, between rewatching the CBS broadcast and taking from what I saw in Beaver Stadium. I truly felt like the whole thing was to gauge, like, these new wide receivers and Drew and pass protection and different reads in live game situation. I really feel that way. I don't think, I think it was one of those games where James was like, look, if we need to hunker down in the second half because we can't throw and make this happen, we'll get behind the big guys and we'll grind this out. But he didn't have to. And I think a lot of the stalling happened because I think Penn State intentionally was one-dimensional. And I think they were successful. And look, even with the 4 field goals, think of the games that, I was watching Miami Notre Dame last night, and Miami couldn't get a field goal off. They had a bad snap. LSU and Clemson had a missed field goal in there. Texas and Ohio State had missed field goals. The back Ryan Barker was 4 for 4. That's huge. And that pays off at some point. So I don't know what you think about that, but I really think where Penn State is right now is they're just, they're tuning up the engine. They're going through, they're overhauling everything. They want to make sure that this thing is efficient and can perform.
Absolutely, and we'll talk a lot more about Ryan Barker and players like that throughout the season. But that's going to do it for segment 2 of Joe and the Fat Man. Segment 3, we'll talk about what James Franklin talked about in his second weekly press conference of 2025.